now let's take a look at news stories making headlines around the globe. First off, for the second time in a few days, the Senate yesterday failed to enshrine real-time mandatory electronic transmission of election results into Nigeria's electoral law, opting instead for a controversial amendment that leaves the process to the discretion of the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC. At a tense, chaotic and at times disorderly emergency sitting, the upper chamber made a dramatic U-turn on its earlier position and passed an amendment to the 2022 Electoral Act approving electronic transmission of results from polling units but retaining provisions for manual collation where network challenges with transmission occur. By recommending that if electronic transmission fails, each polling officer could send results by manual transmission to the next level of collation center, the Senate has opened the door to chaos. With many of the country's 176,974 polling units potentially citing network challenges, resulting to manual transmission increases the likelihood of tampering and manipulation of results by claiming electronic transmission failure. Also, with results moving physically from thousands of polling units to collation centers, critics warned the issue of the integrity of the results would be called into question. They also warned that delays, manipulation, conflicting figures, and breakdown of public trust could overwhelm the electoral system and threaten national stability, adding further that the country could be plunged into widespread confusion, disputes, and post-election chaos. Coming on Order 1B and 52.6, the Chief Senate Whip of the Senate, Mohammed Monguno, in a motion called for the amendment of Wednesday's votes and proceedings, precisely the affected page 1482, and recommitted it with a new proposal that would allow the presiding officers to transmit election results electronically, provided there is no network failure to INEC IREV portal. Senate voted that, and I quote, where there is a network failure, then the duly signed Form EC8A by the presiding officers and party agents where available will then be the primary source of election results. End of quote. The People's Democratic Party, PDP, has criticized the Senate's reconsidered position on the real-time electronic transmission of election results, describing the inclusion of a provision for manual transmission where technology fails as clever by half. PDP National Publicity Secretary Ini Ememobong says the party argued that manual transmission is already covered by the Electoral Act and that the push for electronic transmission is meant to serve as an additional safeguard against results manipulation during collation, a problem it says has long undermined Nigeria's electoral credibility. Meanwhile, the African Democratic Congress has described the reversal of the controversial provisions in the Electoral Amendment Bill by the Senate as a major victory for Nigerian citizens. The ADC described the development as, and I quote, a legislative U-turn, end quote, and proof that united civic action can overcome partisan manipulation. The party, in a statement by its National Publicity Secretary, Bolaji Abdullahi, called on Nigerians to remain vigilant and continue applying pressure until the bill is fully assented to by President Bola Tinubu, properly gazetted, and formally becomes law. It also describes the reversal as a significant victory for the Nigerian people. In other news, President Bola Tinubu has called for reforms to move beyond talk to tangible results, insisting government decisions must improve the daily lives of Nigerians. Speaking at the closing of the National Economic Council Conference in Abuja, where he was represented by Senate President Godswill Akpabio, Tinubu also reaffirmed support for state governments as key drivers of national development. State House correspondent Adesua Moran reports.
On the second and final day of the National Economic Council Conference, security dominates discussions, with warnings that stability is key to economic growth. National Security Advisor, represented by the Minister of Defense, says joint operations and intelligence sharing are now central to Nigeria's evolving security framework.
The strategic recalibration by the Office of the National Security Advisor since 2023 demonstrates that durable security is achieved not through force alone, but through the deliberate integration of governance reform, economic empowerment, technological innovation, community partnership, and conflict prevention.
The police echoes the view, while warning against a one-size-fits-all approach. Speakers also highlight the role of local governments and the private security sector and industry employing millions and filling critical gaps in public safety. Beyond security, questions were raised about Nigeria's federal structure.
The land on the surface right belongs to the governor or the state government, but the resources inside of the land belongs to another person. Is that the practice of federalism? And that's why we keep going around the same circle over the years. And for me, the solution is that we must now interrogate our practice of federalism and go back to where we have missed our practice of federalism.
Closing the conference, President Tinubu, represented by the Senate President, reaffirmed support for subnational government, but stresses reforms must deliver tangible results.
Let me be clear. Reform is not an event. It is a process. It requires courage, patience, and consistency. The decisions we make here must translate into visible improvements in the daily lives of all Nigerians.
The conference concluded calling for, among other things, stronger federal-state coordination, investment in human capital, security collaboration, and public-private partnerships as Nigeria pursues a $1 trillion economy under the Renewed Hope agenda. It has officially ended the National Economic Council Conference for 2026 after 2 days of broad deliberations. However, conferences and communiques are not in short supply. What is left to be seen is how the broad resolutions reached here in the past 2 days translate into action and tangible change for Nigerians across the country. From the presidential villa, Adesua Omoruan, Arise News.
Thank you, Adesua. Well, Minister of Budget and Economic Planning, Senator Abubakar Bagudu, has praised President Bola Tinubu for strengthening the nation's federal system, noting that his economic reforms have increased funds for the subnational governments to provide more amenities for the constituents. Speaking at the National Economic Council Conference, which concluded yesterday in Abuja, the minister said President Tinubu has strengthened our federalism. In his words, the minister told participants that the country is now more united federation due to the bold decisions the president made. He highlighted the president's support for the NEC, which includes the 36 state governors and the Federal Capital Territory FCT. The minister stressed that the president had fostered greater cooperation among the federal, state, and local governments. Nigeria plans to start selling state-owned assets to private investors this year as the authorities seek to leverage economic reforms aimed at drawing capital to the West African nation, a Bloomberg report said yesterday. The government is identifying which assets it will sell along with the timeline of when they will be offered. Finance Minister Wale Edun said this in an interview on the sidelines of the AIUIA Conference for Emerging Market Economies in Saudi Arabia. In his words, the plan is to offer some assets in 2026. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu embarked on a series of reforms that are taking office in May 2023, including eliminating costly petrol subsidies, allowing the currency to trade more freely against the dollar, and overhauling its tax laws. The measures helped rein in consumer inflation, stabilize the naira, and boost government revenue. Nigeria previously privatized assets, including power generation and distribution assets in 2013 and state telecom operator Nitel in 2015. Also, Edun has said that developing economies must rely less on external financing as high global interest rates and geopolitical tensions continue to strain public finances. All right, okay, Rufai, stories, of course, the updates, the emergency plenary held by the Senate. A number of people waited with bated breath to see what the conclusion of that meeting would be. Now, the conclusion is in your take on this story, amongst, of course, the other stories in the news.
Let me just quickly talk about the sale of assets. Please, we need to do it right. It should not be sold to cronies and friends, because we know what has eroded every sale of assets. Corruption, one way or the other. Should we talk about the NITER deal? Should we even talk about the power sector deal? Most of the people that they sold those assets to, they couldn't even service the assets. Most of them, banks are collecting back the assets from them. So we should be able to do our due diligence, not for the sake of selling assets. And please, we need to beg them. It's not a way to hive off assets to cronies. The reason why we're hiving off assets simply is because we need money to be able to run our encumbrances, which we do not have. So for all of those making the argument that we're getting revenue, yes, but like they said last year that we had, the money that came to the federation account is 10 trillion. It also shows that we didn't get enough revenue to service our budgets. That's why we are running a 2025 budget cycle in 2026 that will end in March. And we've been doing that since this administration got in. So the sale of assets, they've been talking about this. I mean, Tilewa came here a couple of times, said, sell off wells and things like that and all of that. In fact, he even targeted we can give about $50 billion if we sell. The question is, what are they going to do with the money? Hope they are not going to die the money. That's just it. And for Mr. Bagudu that is saying there's not transparency, Nigeria is more united as a federation, that's not true. I don't see that. Mr. Bagudu comment on the local government situation that is happening in Osun State.
True. That
the president is playing politics with federalism because he's against his APC people. Yeah, we told him, is that what's supposed to be the order of the day? They've passed local government autonomy since God knows when. They've not been able to implement it. So we are playing all sorts of politics. Does that mean the federation is united? They are saying, yeah, we're giving the governors more money. At what exchange rate? After a devaluation. That's why the governments are not being able to get anything. The other time they said they are sharing out 1.9 trillion for all the states. Yes, they are making more money, but the true growth of the state will come from their capacity to be able to internally generate revenue. And that's why we say kudos to Enugu this morning. That's astronomically raised their IGR. So the states should not become a begistans. A beggy every time from the federal pulse. They too should be able to stand alone. But as a federal unit, we are not united. There's still a lot of division. That's why you see there's a stifling of opposition voice. That's why almost every state governor is saying, I want to go close to the center. I want to go close to the center. That's why we are joining APC. So as regards that, anyway, you don't expect Atiku Bagudu to talk differently from what he will say. As regards the Senate, I mean, I said all these things here yesterday. I gave all the worst case scenarios, and one of them just happened. Because I know them, it's about their own selfish interest. And I think we've successfully been able to debunk all the arguments. Those that said there's no network across the country, 95% transmission went through in the last election cycle. So what arguments are they making again? Despite the fact that there was a technical glitch INEC cannot tell us about. Those that made the argument that we don't have enough network coverage, you can also use satellite data to be able to transfer all of this. You can even partner with the telecoms company to give you dedicated networks on that day. So there are many alternatives. For every one argument they make, I'll give you 10 to 15 different alternatives. There are so many alternatives. So they know they don't have the argument there, but it's just because they've never won election fairly. Now, we know some of them in that Senate. You see some of them that they won election to the courts. Have you forgotten how Bukachua was saying that lots of these senators used to come and meet him? We know how some people got to the Senate they are today now. Funny decisions through the courts. We know what they did in the courts. So why are we surprised? So all they have just done is that they have not passed anything. You know, I told you yesterday that they are talking to their consultants. I'm sure probably they advised them, just change the English. All they just did is to change the English. They think Nigerians are daft. You see, it's the effrontery for these politicians to think we are very daft and dumb. That's what annoys me the most. They want to put a wool over your face. I'm sure they are what's they call, their advisors, their consultants, just say, change the English. Tell them that, yes, we shall, shall carries authority. You shall use, electronic transmission to the IRF. But when electronic transmission is not going through, what will you do? You will go to manual collation. And who will you put the discretion in the hands of? In the hands of the technical glitches. In the hands of the electoral officer. All the electoral officer, after you've compromised them, need to come and say that there's technical glitch. Everybody will do manual transmission, and 2 or 2 people will second it. when you go one step further, the question is, does it even make the IREF justiciable? See, part of the argument is that we must make the IREF justiciable.
Okay.
The result on the IREF. Because if it's not justiciable, how can you defend case in court? No political party can get, out of 176,900 polling units thereabout, no political party can get all of the ECAT forms from those polling units to be able to defend themselves in courts.
Okay. That's
why we are saying the IREF is the next close place. So they just ended up deceiving themselves. Nigerians, don't sleep on your right to this your future. You want them to deceive you again.
all right. Dr. Abati, your take on this story.
Okay, first, let's start with what happened in the National Assembly yesterday. It was Joseph Stalin who said that those who vote decide nothing. Those who count the votes are the ones who take the decisions. That's Joseph Stalin, maximum dictator in the USSR, United Soviet Union Republic. Now, however, while you have that at the back of your mind, what was done at the National Assembly yesterday, you say, I don't want to give myself any credit, very close to what I recommended in my column yesterday at the back page of this day, which is that perhaps the best way forward is a hybrid solution. They have now provided a hybrid solution, namely that Section 60, sub 3, has now been revisited, and the Senate, voting unanimously, has now said, okay, you can have electronic transmission, which they had insisted previously was there in the guidelines for the process. Now put it in Section 60, sub 3. However, in places where you do not have internet, where you do not have the infrastructure, you will have to rely on Form EC 8A, which will be documented, and then send that to IREF. Okay, if we interrogate this, what is here for the Nigerian public? Number one, the Senate has shown that it listened to Nigerians. It listened to the civil society groups and the spokespersons of civil society, and it has now tried to meet them midway. It has also shown that it is a Senate that does not want instability, because to have ignored all those protesters, led by Mr. Peter Obi, led by former Minister Rotimi Amechi, and other stakeholders in the civil society, will have amounted to, acting arrogantly and saying the people do not matter. So now the people have been met midway, halfway, and the Senate now says, hey, yes, Section 60, sub 3, you can transmit electronically, but if it fails, you still go back to Form EC 8A, to IREF. Now, I argued yesterday that the Supreme Court in December 2023, I think, had argued that the IREF portal is a viewing center, is not a collation center. The Senate, in considering all of this, has not said, electronic transmission should be real-time, should be mandatory. There are clauses there, okay? And then the Supreme Court itself, we have not heard that Supreme Court has reversed itself by saying, now it's not from EC8A, it is direct transmission. So there's a red herring here that I see, And then the other part of it, I argued yesterday that whether you call it electronic voting or electronic transmission, whatever you call it, depending on your level of knowledge, it is a very costly process. INEC is a body that is empowered under the Constitution to count the votes. Now, to count the votes, whether it's electronic transmission or to IREF portal, they must have capacity. And I said, electronic transmission is in itself costly. Do we have the mechanism? Do we have the funds? Would the federal government provide the funds? Who is going to work on the infrastructure ahead of the election? Because you need to have a functioning infrastructure in place. Everybody is saying we're in the age of satellite. We're in the age of real-time transmission. Okay, you need to have the infrastructure. So if INEC does not have the money, how are they going to do it? And then there is the Supreme Court ruling, December 2023, which says the recognized form of transmission is from EC 8A. Now, you can use legislation to override what is happening, the situation. But as the Senate or the National Assembly, provided the enabling legislation to override the subsisting Supreme Court decisions. So there are issues in terms of capacity, in terms of funding, in terms of, the extant position of the law. So those are issues we may have to deal with later. However, after the process yesterday at the Senate, you are likely to have what is called harmonization. In the US, they call it reconciliation of the submissions from the two chambers. Now, that's why I argued in my piece yesterday that it's a long conversation. And for the benefit of those people who may understand what I was talking about, some of those issues have come to light. Now, to go straight to the sale of assets. Now, I will go to Dr. Ayo Teriba. Dr. Ayo Teriba, a regular member of This Day Live, a member of the This Day family. He has consistently argued on this table that, yes, sale of assets should be value-driven. And I've also read an article in ProShare. I read ProShare, I read Nairametrics, all these platforms. And, ProShare is even quoting also Ayo Teriba, saying that, look, it's not enough to just say you are going to sell state-holding assets to defray, I think, about 25 trillion, 27 trillion deficit in the 2026 budget. Now, the best that you can get is that you are selling assets worth 189.1 billion. And that represents about 1% of the deficit in the budget itself. So there are issues about how it's not just you just sell to collect money. That will not have effect. That's the argument of Ayo Teriba and also ProShare. The argument is that how do you use this sale of assets, which Chief Olawale Edun was presenting at an Alula investment conference in Saudi Arabia, to reinvent the situation, because it is common knowledge that taxation is not even enough to fix the deficit. So at the end of the day, you go and borrow. So the wisdom out here is that there are issues with transparency. Who gets those assets? What is the methodology, the evaluation methodology for selling those assets? Where is accountability? In other words, what is being proposed is something to be interrogated further. It's not enough to say federal government is going to sell assets to collect more money. If you collect more money, after all, we have sold assets in this country before. Nothing happened. It's not just to have cash revenue. The whole idea should be about value creation. And that's why I've piggybacked on the argument of Dr. Ayo Teriba of this family, and also ProShare that did an extensive explanation. Now, the other issue about Senator Bagudu and co and all of that, no, we discussed this subject yesterday, but it's okay that you have repeated it. What the president is saying is that he's committed to reviving this economy, and that the reform project is alive and well, and that his administration is committed to doing more. Now, all the other people that commented, they were just backrubbing the president. That's expected. All the state governments, they have more money now. President Tinubu has given off more money. What have they done with it? That's why people at the subnational level should also speak up. And then, of course, I think it was instructive that the president also commended the vice president, his vice president, for providing credible leadership in leading the National Economic Council. I think that was a subtle message by the president to those who have been talking about, the second term and whether Vice President Shettima will be on the ticket or not. But as for the governors and all the other commentators, what do you expect them to say, of course? They will just repeat what the president has said. But we are going to have Minister Bagudu coming here, so we will ask him who can integrate
Yeah, we can
further.
actually take that conversation even deeper and hopefully can expound on some of the things that were discussed and the outcome of the NEC, which ended yesterday. We saw that report by Adeso Amoran. I'll just take one of the stories so that we're able to have that conversation with Minister Bagudu. And, in the talk around the electronic transmission of results, some of the reasons that have been given, the platitude offered by the Senate, and yesterday by sort of saying, okay, take this as a placebo, even though there wasn't real content in terms of what the people were asking for. And at the core of what the protests, the comments by opposition, by stakeholders in the Nigerian state is for Nigerians to have the opportunity to have free, fair and credible elections, and that the Senate or the legislature should take its own role by providing the framework on which platform this can occur. And that's why there was a lot of, focus on them being able to ensure that at least, yes, we can say, oh yeah, there's still a long path to electronic voting and making it justiciable, but in inspiring confidence and, in the Nigerian people that they can trust the state to prosecute a free, fair and credible election would have been in the right direction. And the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. And so a bit of disappointment there. But at the end of the day, this is what we have now. Let's see how it will be received. Some opposition members have already come out to say that it is, it's not anything or it's just scratching it at all. But one area that I think we can borrow lessons from is the case study of India. How has India been able to prosecute elections or run elections in a country with almost 4 times the size of Nigeria with regards to their electorate? One of the key areas is the employment of technology, but done in a very clever way. They use the electronic voting machine, but it's different because it doesn't rely on internet connectivity. Now, this will solve the challenge that has been identified by the Senate as to why they are not able to make it mandatory for real-time transmission of election results. If we can, and this is Nigeria that is a hotbed of technological advancement on the African continent. Yesterday, Flutterwave celebrated 10 years. We have a few unicorn companies in Nigeria. We have our own, technological headquarters in India. But in many areas, we've seen technological eggheads in Nigeria, young people who can design similar to what India has in the EVM. The timeline, I'm sure that if they're given, and because it's already there, they're not recreating anything new. It's technology that already exists. What we're just doing is to copy what already exists. It's a standalone unit. You don't need Wi-Fi, you don't need Bluetooth or internet capability. And then it is decentralized from the core area so that it cannot be hacked remotely. So they have thought ahead. If India can do it with about 854 million voters, why can't Nigeria do it with only, about less than 4 times the number of that? Beyond that, when you vote in India, there's a paper audit trail. This, again, is an added layer of security to ensure that people's votes actually count. I'm saying this because this has already worked in a country that we can at least compare quite, closely to Nigeria. We have the technological brains. We have the willpower to do it as well. We can do it in a short space of time because it already exists. You're not creating anything new. Another area when we're talking long-term about credibility of elections and legislators to support this is that while we focus on this aspect of the law, let's also keep the conversation alive around the independence of INEC. I say this because this is also what has been employed in India to ensure that the electoral body is independent of, influence by the executive to the extent that the head of the body cannot be taken away. It's in the same way that you cannot take away the CBN governor. So giving that sort of autonomy to the INEC chair to ensure that Nigerians have a chance at fixing what has long been electoral processes that are fraught with litigations, where the court end up deciding, what the end of the results are. That is what we're trying to prevent come 2027. And it is possible. But, well, all eyes were on the legislature this time to see if they could make a difference in ensuring that Nigerians have access to that. It has been done before, it can be replicated, and we can achieve it here in Nigeria.